The biggest mistakes are usually made by people who think they already know the answer. Mason Reed stopped pushing the mop before anyone else in the building noticed the problem. The design studio on the 12th floor of Hale Dynamics was supposed to be empty. Most employees had already gone home. The few engineers still working sat behind glass walls illuminated by computer screens and desk lamps. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Mason had cleaned the same floor every evening for almost 3 years. Most employees barely noticed him. That never bothered him. He came in after hours, did his work, and returned home to his daughter. It was simple. Predictable. Quiet. Tonight felt different. As he pushed the mop past one of the conference rooms, something caught his eye. A large technical drawing rested on the table beneath a bright overhead light. Several pages were spread across the polished surface. Colored annotations filled the margins. Mason glanced at it for only a second before continuing forward. Then he stopped. Slowly, he backed up and looked again. The drawing showed a component scheduled for a major product launch. He stared at one specific section. His eyes narrowed slightly. For several moments he said nothing. Then he set the mop aside and stepped closer. The room was empty. Through the glass walls, engineers continued working elsewhere in the office. Nobody appeared to notice him. Mason studied the blueprint carefully. His expression remained calm, but something about the design bothered him. A measurement. A placement. A single detail most people would overlook. He looked around once more. Still nobody watching. Then he picked up a red pencil lying beside the documents. With one small movement, he adjusted a line on the page. Barely half an inch. The correction seemed insignificant. Almost invisible. Yet after making it, Mason nodded slightly to himself. The design now looked complete. He placed the pencil back exactly where he found it. Then he returned to the mop. Across town, his 11-year-old daughter Lily sat inside a public library finishing homework while waiting for him to finish work. Every Thursday evening followed the same routine. Mason would pick her up on his way home. They would stop for sandwiches. Then they would spend the rest of the night together in their small apartment. Lily never complained about the schedule. She simply enjoyed the time they shared. Back on the 12th floor, Mason continued cleaning as though nothing had happened. But only a few minutes later, the conference room door opened. A young project coordinator entered carrying a stack of reports. She froze when she saw the marked blueprint. Her eyes immediately moved to the red correction. Confusion crossed her face. Then concern. She hurried toward the hallway and called for one of the engineers. Within moments, several employees gathered around the table. Mason noticed the activity from across the room. He quietly lowered his eyes and continued working. Nobody had seen him make the change. At least that was what he believed. Because standing near the elevator, watching the entire scene unfold, was someone who had seen exactly what happened. And she did not look pleased. Mason Reed kept moving the mop as engineers gathered around the conference table. From a distance, he looked exactly like what everyone assumed he was. A janitor finishing the last tasks of a long shift. Invisible. Ordinary. Easy to overlook. The voices near the blueprint gradually became louder. One engineer pointed at the red correction. Another immediately disagreed. A third began comparing the marked drawing against the original digital model displayed on a laptop. The discussion grew increasingly animated. Mason never looked in their direction. He pushed the mop down another hallway and continued working. Near the elevator, Victoria Hale watched everything unfold. As chief executive officer of Hale Dynamics, she rarely remained in the office this late. Tonight had been different. The company was only weeks away from unveiling its most important product in years. Pressure filled every department. Investors were expecting results. Competitors were moving aggressively. Every decision mattered. That was why seeing a janitor place markings on a confidential design had instantly caught her attention. Victoria stepped toward the conference room. What happened? The room quieted immediately. One of the senior engineers answered first. Someone altered the blueprint. Victoria's expression hardened. Someone? Another employee glanced toward the hallway. The janitor. Several heads turned toward Mason. He continued cleaning without reacting. Victoria followed their gaze. Did anyone authorize that? No one answered. The silence told her everything she needed to know. She entered the conference room and examined the drawing herself. The red correction stood out clearly against the printed design. A simple adjustment. Small. Unapproved. Completely inappropriate. Victoria felt frustration rising. Months of engineering work. Thousands of labor hours. Hundreds of technical reviews. And now a maintenance employee had decided to modify a critical design document. She turned immediately and walked toward Mason. Several employees followed. Others watched from behind glass walls. Mason heard the footsteps before she spoke. He stopped and looked up calmly. Can I help you? Victoria held up the blueprint. Did you make this change? Mason looked at the page. Then nodded. Yes. The admission came so easily that several employees exchanged surprised looks. No hesitation. No attempt to deny it. Victoria stared at him. You altered a restricted design without permission. Mason remained calm. I adjusted one measurement. Why? For a moment Mason considered the question. Because it was wrong. The hallway fell silent. Some employees looked shocked. Others looked amused. One engineer quietly laughed under his breath. Victoria did not. You are telling me that a room full of professional engineers missed something, but you found it while cleaning floors? Mason glanced at the blueprint. I noticed a problem. Victoria folded her arms. And what exactly qualifies you to make that judgment? The question hung in the air. Employees waited for an explanation. A defense. Some impressive credential. Instead, Mason simply looked at the drawing again. Then back at Victoria. Nobody asked me before. The answer generated confusion rather than clarity. Victoria's patience disappeared. To her, the situation was becoming obvious. A janitor had crossed a professional boundary and now refused to acknowledge it. Around them, employees continued watching. Nobody noticed that one of the engineers near the conference room had quietly returned to the digital model and was staring at the screen with growing concern. Victoria Hale looked at Mason Reed for several long seconds. The hallway had become unusually quiet. Engineers stood near the conference room entrance. Project managers lingered nearby pretending to review documents while listening to every word. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Victoria finally made her decision. Turn in your badge. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Several employees shifted uncomfortably. Mason simply nodded once. No argument. No protest. No attempt to explain himself. Victoria interpreted the reaction as confirmation that she was making the right choice. Hale Dynamics handles confidential development projects, she continued. Employees do not alter engineering documents without authorization. Mason reached into his pocket and removed his access badge. Understood. One of the younger engineers looked away. Another seemed relieved that the situation was ending. To most of them, the conclusion felt obvious. A janitor had crossed a line. The consequences followed. Mason placed the badge in Victoria's hand. His expression never changed. That calmness irritated her more than she expected. Most people fought to keep their jobs. Most people offered excuses. Mason did neither. "You are not going to say anything?" she asked. Mason glanced toward the blueprint still tucked beneath her arm. "I already said what mattered." Several employees exchanged confused looks. Victoria folded her arms. "And what was that?" "The measurement was wrong." A few people laughed quietly. Victoria did not. "You are no longer employed here." Mason nodded. "Then I hope someone checks it." With that, he picked up the mop bucket and started walking toward the service elevator. The conversation was over. Behind him, whispers immediately began. Some employees shook their heads. Others joked quietly about the confidence of a janitor correcting engineers. Victoria turned toward the conference room, ready to move on. Then a voice interrupted the moment. "Wait." Everyone looked toward the doorway. The engineer who had been studying the digital model stood frozen beside his workstation. His face had lost color. Victoria frowned. "What is it?" He did not answer immediately. His eyes remained locked on the screen. Several people stepped closer. The room suddenly felt different. "That adjustment," he finally said. "Run the simulation again." Another engineer frowned. "We already tested it." "Run it again." The urgency in his voice silenced the room. A colleague entered new values into the system. The simulation restarted. Seconds passed. Then more seconds. Nobody spoke. Mason continued walking toward the elevator without looking back. The engineers stared at the screen. Victoria watched their expressions change one by one. Confusion. Concentration. Then concern. The engineer nearest the monitor leaned forward. "That cannot be right." Another checked the calculations manually. A third opened additional files. The silence grew heavier with every passing moment. Victoria took a step closer. "Someone tell me what is happening." No one answered immediately. Finally the senior engineer looked up. His expression was no longer amused. It was troubled. Deeply troubled. He glanced toward the hallway where Mason had almost reached the elevator. Then he looked back at Victoria. The original design fails under full production load. The hallway went completely silent. Mason stopped walking for only a fraction of a second. Then he continued toward the elevator without turning around. Nobody moved. For several seconds, the only sound came from the rain tapping against the windows. The senior engineer's statement seemed impossible. The original design had passed months of reviews. It had survived countless meetings, simulations, and approvals. Yet now the numbers on the screen were telling a different story. Victoria Hale stepped into the conference room. "Explain it." The engineer swallowed. "Under standard testing conditions, the system performs correctly." He pointed toward the monitor. "But under full production load, stress accumulates here." His finger moved across the digital model. The failure point appears exactly where the adjustment was made. Another engineer quickly verified the calculations. Then another. One by one, their expressions shifted from skepticism to concern. Nobody laughed anymore. Victoria stared at the simulation results. The corrected version continued running successfully. The original design did not. "Run it again," she said. They did. The outcome remained unchanged. Again. The same result. A third test produced identical numbers. Across the hallway, Mason Reed reached the service elevator. The doors opened with a soft chime. He rolled the mop bucket inside. For a brief moment, he glanced back toward the conference room. Employees rushed between workstations. Conversations overlapped. Urgency had replaced confidence. Then the elevator doors closed. Downstairs, the city library was preparing to close for the evening. Lily Reed sat near the front windows with a backpack beside her chair. She had finished her homework nearly 30 minutes earlier. Most children her age would have complained about waiting. Lily never did. She knew her father worked hard. Every Thursday ended the same way. He picked her up after work. They talked during the drive home. Those conversations mattered more than anything else. Back on the 12th floor, Victoria continued reviewing reports. The atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier, employees had assumed a janitor interfered with a project he could not understand. Now a more uncomfortable possibility was emerging. What if he understood it better than they did? The thought irritated her. Not because it challenged her authority. Because it challenged logic itself. None of it made sense. How could he know? One engineer asked quietly. Nobody answered. Another engineer reopened archived development files. A third reviewed months of design revisions. The search for an explanation had already begun. Victoria folded her arms. Who is he? The room remained silent. Human resources records offered little information. Mason Reed. Maintenance staff. 3 years of employment. Excellent. Attendance. No disciplinary issues. No engineering credentials listed. Nothing remarkable. Yet the correction on the blueprint remained impossible to ignore. One engineer leaned back from his computer. The adjustment solved a problem we did not know existed. Another nodded. And he found it in less than a minute. Victoria looked toward the elevator doors at the end of the hallway. For the first time that evening, uncertainty entered her thoughts. 5 minutes earlier she had been completely confident in her decision. Now she was not sure what had just happened. Somewhere in the city, Mason was already heading toward a routine evening with his daughter. Inside Hale Dynamics, however, a much larger question had taken hold. If a janitor had just saved their most important project, then who exactly had they fired? The investigation continued long after Mason Reed left the building. Midnight came and went. Nobody in the engineering department went home. Workstations remained lit across the 12th floor. Coffee cups accumulated beside keyboards. Whiteboards filled with calculations. Every new review produced the same conclusion. The adjustment Mason made was correct. More troubling was the discovery that followed. The flaw had been hidden deep inside a chain of assumptions made months earlier. Dozens of talented professionals had examined the design. None had seen it. Yet somehow a janitor walking past a conference room had noticed it almost immediately. Victoria Hale stood beside the main display screen watching another simulation finish successfully. The corrected version passed again. The original version failed again. There was no longer any debate. The question was no longer whether Mason was right. The question was how. One senior engineer leaned back in his chair. I do not understand it. Another nodded. Neither do I. A younger engineer opened archived project files. Maybe he worked in manufacturing before. Someone else checked personnel records again. Nothing. No engineering degree. No design certifications. No technical employment history listed anywhere in the file. The records described an ordinary maintenance employee. Yet nothing about the evening felt ordinary anymore. Victoria stared at Mason's employment profile displayed on a monitor. 3 years. Perfect attendance. Positive performance reviews. No complaints. No incidents. She remembered every interaction she had just had with him. His calmness. His confidence. The way he never tried to impress anyone. Most importantly, she remembered his final words. I hope someone checks it. Not I think I am right. Not you are making a mistake. Just a simple statement. As though the outcome had never been in doubt. Across town, Mason sat with Lily inside a small sandwich shop they visited every Thursday evening. Rain continued falling outside. The restaurant was nearly empty. Lily told stories about school while Mason listened carefully. He smiled when appropriate. Asked questions. Paid attention. Nothing about his behavior suggested he had just lost his job. Finally Lily tilted her head. Did something happen at work? Mason looked at her. Children noticed more than adults realized. A little. Bad? Mason thought for a moment. Maybe. Lily studied him carefully. You do not seem worried. A faint smile appeared on his face. Worrying does not usually fix anything. Lily accepted the answer and returned to her sandwich. Meanwhile, back at Hale Dynamics, a breakthrough finally occurred. One of the engineers opened an old internal archive connected to the earliest stages of the project. He froze. Then he leaned closer to the screen. Victoria. She looked up immediately. What is it? He did not answer right away. Instead, he turned the monitor toward her. An old design document filled the screen. The date was nearly 15 years old. The signature at the bottom belonged to the original creator of the core architecture they still use today. Victoria's eyes moved slowly across the page. Then she saw the name. The room became silent again. Because for the first time that night, they had found a clue explaining how Mason Reed knew exactly where to look. The room remained silent as Victoria Hale stared at the old design document. The date alone was enough to attract attention. 15 years earlier, long before Hale Dynamics became an industry leader, the foundational architecture behind their most successful products had been created by a small team of engineers working under intense deadlines. Most of those names were now famous within the industry. Some had become executives. Others had started their own companies. One name, however, seemed completely impossible. Mason Reed. Several engineers immediately moved closer to the monitor. One thought it was a mistake. Another assumed it must belong to someone else with the same name. Yet the more records they opened, the harder that explanation became to believe. Additional design files appeared. Technical reviews. Patent submissions. Internal development notes. The same name appeared again and again. Mason Reed. LED Systems Architect. Mason Reed. Senior Design Engineer. Mason Reed. Core Platform Creator. The room grew quieter with every file they opened. Victoria felt a strange sensation settle in her chest. Not disbelief anymore. Regret. One engineer shook his head slowly. This cannot be the same person. Another opened an archived employee photograph attached to an old company directory. The image loaded. Nobody spoke. It was Mason. Younger. Wearing a suit instead of maintenance clothing. But unquestionably Mason. The silence became absolute. Victoria remembered standing in the hallway only hours earlier. She remembered asking what qualified him to question the work of professional engineers. Now she knew the answer. He had not questioned their work as an outsider. He had recognized a flaw inside a system he originally helped create. One engineer leaned back in his chair. Why would someone like that work as a janitor? Nobody knew. Human resources records contained almost nothing after his departure from the engineering world. It was as though he had simply disappeared. Meanwhile, across town, Mason and Lily were driving home through light rain. Traffic moved slowly beneath glowing streetlights. Lily sat quietly for a few moments before speaking. Can I ask another question? Mason smiled. You usually do. She laughed. Did you ever have a different job? Mason glanced at her briefly. The question caught him off guard. Why do you ask? Lily shrugged. Sometimes when people explain things at school, you already know the answers before they finish talking. Mason looked back at the road. I have done a lot of different things. Lily seemed satisfied with that. She returned her attention to the passing lights outside the window. Back at Hale Dynamics, Victoria continued reading. The deeper she searched, the worse she felt. Industry awards. Technical publications. Patent credits. Mason had once been considered one of the brightest engineering minds in the field. Yet he had never mentioned any of it. Not during 3 years of employment. Not when he corrected the blueprint. Not even when she fired him. That realization disturbed her most of all. Someone else might have used those accomplishments to defend themselves. Mason had remained silent. Finally Victoria stood. Her decision came immediately. Find him. Several employees looked up. Tonight? One asked. Victoria nodded. Tonight. Outside, rain continued falling across Chicago. Somewhere in the city, the man she had dismissed was helping his daughter prepare for bed. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Hale understood that fixing the design problem might be easier than fixing the mistake she had made. Victoria Hale left the office shortly after midnight. Several executives offered to accompany her. She refused. This was not a board matter. It was not an engineering matter. It was a mistake she had made personally. The rain had stopped by the time she drove through the quiet streets of Chicago. The city lights reflected across wet pavement as she followed the address listed in Mason Reed's employee file. During the drive, she could not stop thinking about everything she had learned. Awards. Patents. Industry recognition. Innovations that had shaped entire product lines. Yet none of it explained the question that bothered her most. Why would someone with that history choose to spend 3 years cleaning office floors without telling anyone who he was? Across town, Mason sat at a small kitchen table helping Lily finish a science assignment. Their apartment was modest but warm. School books covered half the table. A stuffed rabbit sat beside Lily's notebook. The evening felt completely normal. Lily was explaining a classroom project when someone knocked on the door. Both looked up. Mason glanced at the clock. Nearly 11 o'clock. He was not expecting visitors. Lily raised an eyebrow. That is late. Mason smiled. It is. He walked to the door and opened it. For the first time all evening, surprise appeared on his face. Victoria stood in the hallway. Not surrounded by executives. Not accompanied by lawyers. Alone. For a moment neither spoke. Then Mason stepped aside. Come in. Victoria entered slowly. The apartment felt nothing like the executive world she occupied every day. Family photographs covered one wall. School drawings decorated another. The space felt honest. Comfortable. Real. Lily looked up from the table. Hi. Victoria smiled politely. Hello, Lily. Mason offered a chair. Victoria sat. For several seconds she searched for the right words. None seemed adequate. Finally she spoke. I owe you an apology. Mason remained quiet. Victoria continued. I judged you before I understood who you were. Mason shook his head slightly. You judged what you saw. The answer somehow made the apology feel heavier. Victoria lowered her eyes. That does not make it right. Silence settled across the room. Lily looked between them, clearly trying to understand the conversation. Victoria took a slow breath. The design correction was accurate. Mason nodded. I know. No pride. No satisfaction. Just a simple statement of fact. Victoria almost smiled. It was exactly the response she should have expected. The entire engineering team confirmed it. Mason nodded again. Good. Another pause followed. Finally Victoria asked the question that had haunted everyone at Hale Dynamics. Why did you never tell anyone who you were? Mason looked toward Lily. Then back at Victoria. Because I was not interested in being who I was. The answer confused her. Mason noticed. After my wife passed away, Lily needed a father more than the industry needed another engineer. Lily quietly reached for her father's hand. He squeezed it gently. Victoria suddenly understood something none of the company records had explained. Mason had not walked away from success because he failed. He had walked away because he chose something more important. And sitting in that small apartment, Victoria realized she had spent years measuring value with the wrong scale. Victoria Hale remained seated at the kitchen table longer than she expected. The conversation had moved far beyond the design flaw that started everything. For the first time since arriving, she stopped thinking like a chief executive officer and started listening like a person. Lily eventually finished her homework and gathered her books. Before heading toward her room, she looked at Victoria. Are you here because of my dad's old job? Victoria smiled softly. Something like that. Lily nodded. People used to call him all the time about it. Mason looked down at the table but said nothing. Victoria noticed. Another piece of the story quietly revealed itself. After Lily disappeared into her room, silence settled over the apartment again. Finally Victoria reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table. Mason glanced at it but did not open it. What is it? He asked. Victoria answered honestly. An offer. Mason smiled faintly. I assumed it might be. Victoria nodded. The board wants you back. Mason did not touch the folder. That was quick. The alternative is delaying a product launch that represents hundreds of millions of dollars. Mason leaned back slightly. Then I understand their urgency. Victoria almost laughed. Even now, he refused to make the situation about himself. They want you to lead the redesign effort. Mason looked toward Lily's room before answering. That is not possible. Victoria had expected hesitation. She had not expected a direct refusal. May I ask why? Mason's answer came immediately. Because my priorities have not changed. The words were simple. Yet they carried more weight than any corporate speech she had heard all year. Victoria understood exactly what he meant. For years, the industry had offered opportunities. Promotions. Recognition. Influence. Mason had walked away from all of it for one reason. The same reason he would not return now. A few moments later, he finally opened the folder. Inside were contracts, compensation proposals, stock options, and executive benefits. The numbers would have changed most people's lives. Mason reviewed them for less than 30 seconds before closing the folder again. It is generous. Victoria sighed. But? Mason smiled. But Lily still needs breakfast tomorrow morning. For the first time that evening, Victoria laughed. Not because the answer was funny. Because it was completely genuine. The simplicity of it felt almost shocking. After years of corporate negotiations, she had forgotten that some decisions were not made on spreadsheets. Before leaving, Victoria stood near the door. Then let me ask a different question. Mason waited. Would you at least help us solve the problem? He considered the request. This time he did not answer immediately. Finally he nodded. I will review the design. Relief appeared across Victoria's face. Not because she had secured an engineer. Because she had earned a second chance. As she prepared to leave, Lily stepped back into the hallway. "Dad?" Mason turned. "Yes?" Lily smiled. "I told you people would figure it out eventually." Mason laughed quietly. Victoria looked between them and suddenly remembered the confidence she had seen in the little girl from the beginning. Lily had never doubted her father for a second. And standing in that doorway, Victoria realized that was probably the smartest judgment anyone had made all week. 3 weeks later, the redesigned system passed every test. Engineers ran simulations around the clock. Independent reviewers examined every component. Production stress evaluations completed successfully. For the first time in months, confidence returned to Hale Dynamics. Yet the most surprising part of the project was not the technical success. It was the way Mason Reed participated. He never accepted an executive office. He never requested a title. He never attended strategy meetings unless absolutely necessary. Most days he reviewed documents remotely from home while Lily completed school assignments nearby. When engineers asked questions, he answered them. When they solved problems on their own, he encouraged them. The same quiet man who once cleaned hallways became the person everyone trusted when the situation became difficult. On the morning of the product launch, employees gathered inside the main auditorium. Excitement filled the building. Investors had arrived. Industry media representatives occupied the front rows. Large screens displayed months of work finally reaching completion. Victoria Hale stood backstage preparing her remarks. Before stepping onto the stage, she looked toward Mason. He stood near the back of the room beside Lily. Exactly where he preferred to be. Victoria smiled. "You should be up front." Mason shook his head. "The team earned that." The answer did not surprise her anymore. When the presentation began, applause filled the auditorium. The launch succeeded. The demonstrations worked flawlessly. Investors responded positively. Months of uncertainty disappeared in a single morning. Yet the most memorable moment arrived near the end. Victoria returned to the stage and paused before reading her prepared closing remarks. Then she folded the paper and set it aside. The audience became quiet. "Before we conclude," she said, "there is one person I need to thank." Mason immediately knew where this was going. He lowered his eyes. Several engineers smiled knowingly. Victoria continued. "A few weeks ago, I made a mistake." The room grew silent. "I judged someone based on a job title instead of character. I assumed expertise could be measured by appearances. I was wrong." Hundreds of people listened carefully. Victoria looked directly toward the back of the room. "The success we celebrate today exists because one person cared enough to notice what everyone else missed." Applause began slowly. Then grew louder. People stood. One row after another. A standing ovation spread across the auditorium. Mason looked uncomfortable immediately. Lily, however, smiled proudly. She started clapping first. Mason glanced down at her and laughed quietly. The audience continued applauding. After a few moments, he gave a small nod of appreciation. Nothing more. No speech. No dramatic response. Just quiet gratitude. Later that afternoon, after the crowds had left and the building had grown quiet, again, Mason and Lily walked toward the parking lot together. The autumn air felt cool. Lily looked up at her father. "So what happens now?" Mason opened the car door for her. "Tomorrow?" Lily nodded. Mason smiled. "Tomorrow you have school." Lily laughed. "That is not what I meant." Mason looked back at the building one last time. Then he looked at his daughter. Sometimes the world eventually notices your value. Lily smiled. I know. Mason nodded. The important part is knowing it before the world does. Together they got into the car and drove away, leaving behind a company that had finally learned what his daughter had understood from the very beginning.